So as part of our walking skeleton, we need to create a database and retrieve values from this database with the methods that we create here in our controllers. Now we're keeping things really simple at this point. So what we're going to do is we're going to create some models based on the values that we see here. And the way that we're going to create our database is to use the model first or code first approach in Entity Framework. And what this means is that we create a class that represents the value. And then using Entity Framework code first migrations, this is going to allow us to scaffold our database, and it's going to create a table to store our values in. And it's going to have two columns, one to represent the ID of the value and one to represent the name. So the first thing we'll do is we'll create a class that represents our value entities. And what we'll do is just inside Solution Explorer here, we'll just create a new folder and we'll call this models. And press return, and inside this models folder we'll create a new C# class, and we've got access to this based on the fact we installed C# extensions earlier on. So we'll use this and we'll say call it value. We don't need to put the extension in, this is going to be added for us automatically by C# extensions. So we'll just call it value, and by convention we use title case in C# for our classes. So it needs to start with a capital V, and we'll just call it value and press return. And this scaffolds the basic class for our value class. And all we're going to do in here is just create two properties. And the way that we do this is we just start typing prop. And this is going to create an automatically implemented property for us. And automatically implemented properties have getters and setters. So we can both get the value and set the value of this particular property inside the value class. Now this is going to be an int for the ID. And we'll call this property ID, and then we'll create a second property, and this is going to be a string, and this is just going to be the name of the value. So both of these properties are public, and they've got getters and setters, which means we can get and set these properties from other parts of our application, and that's fine for what we're doing at this stage. Now we also need to tell Entity Framework about this entity, so that it can go ahead and scaffold our database and create a table for this particular class. And what we'll do to achieve that, we're going to create a DataContext class. And once again, we'll create a new folder at the root of our solution. So click on the new folder and we'll call this one data. And then inside this data folder, we'll create another new class and we'll call this one DataContext and press return. And this goes ahead and creates our DataContext class. Now what we're going to need to do with this one is we're going to need to derive from an Entity Framework core class. And the way that we do that is we add a colon after the DataContext, and the class that we want to derive from is dbContext. Now when we see a red underline here, we hover over and it tells us that we're missing a type or a namespace named dbContext. And are we missing a using directive or an assembly reference? And we are indeed missing a using directive. We need to use the Entity Framework core assembly in order to get access to this particular class, this dbContext. Now we've got a couple of options here. We can click on the light bulb and this will give us some quick fixes we can use. And if we hover over this light bulb, we can see that there's a shortcut key in brackets, and it's command and period in my case because I'm on a Mac. But if you're on Windows, it's probably control and period. And we can also just take our cursor, put it inside where the red squiggles are, and press command and period. However, what we're missing here is the using statement for Entity Framework Core. And this is one of the differences between 2.2 and 3.0. If we were using 2.2 of the runtime and the SDK, then we would have an option to include Entity Framework Core at this stage. But Microsoft have removed some of the assemblies from that shared framework that we get when we're using .NET Core 3.0. And if I just go across to my browser just to demonstrate what this is, there's a GitHub issue where Microsoft have specified that they're removing assemblies from Microsoft ASP.NET Core App 3.0. Now this Microsoft ASP.NET Core App meta package includes various assemblies for use in your application, but some of them have been taken away, and one of them is Microsoft Entity Framework Core. It's been removed from 3.0, and this means we need to add it manually ourselves. Now if I just go back and quickly compare the 2.2 version of the CS proj file that we get as part of our project, then if we take a look at the 3.0 version, it's pretty bare. We've got the reference to the project SDK, Microsoft Net SDK Web, and we've got a target framework of Net Core Ramp 3.0, which of course we're on 3.0, so that's the target framework. If I compare this particular project file with the 2.2 version of this project file, then what we see here is that there's a package reference to include Microsoft ASP.NET Core App, and this includes all of those shared framework assemblies. Now we don't have this package reference listed inside our version on 3.0 because it's automatically included when we use this particular SDK, so we don't need to specify it manually. However, we are still missing the entity framework core assembly that we need in order to make use of that DB-Context class. So what we need to do now is we need to make use of one of the extensions we installed earlier on, the NuGet Package Manager. And in order to use that, what we need to do is we need to open up our command line or our command palette inside VS Code and just search for NuGet. And what we want to do here is use the NuGet Package Manager add package. So I'm just going to click on this, and then we can search for the package that we want. Now be careful with the spelling here because you need to be accurate, and what we want to look for is Microsoft Entity Framework Core, and press return, and this should bring up a list of packages that match what we're looking for. So what we want here actually is the Microsoft Entity Framework Core package, so I'm going to select this, and what we want to do is we want to get the version that matches our runtime. And in this case it's 3.0.0. Please avoid installing the preview versions. These are designed to work with the 3.1 runtime, which is in preview mode just now and probably will be for some time. So we want 3.0.0, whatever matches the runtime that you've installed. So let's select this one, and this will go ahead and install that package, and we'll get the option to restore from this as well. And once this is installed and available, what we should be able to do then is hover our mouse over the DB context, press Control and period, and now we've got the option to use Microsoft Entity Framework Core. So we'll select this, and what this does is adds the using statement at the top, because the DB context class, if we hover over it, is part of the Microsoft.Entity Framework Core assembly. Now this DB context that we're deriving from, this represents a session with the database and can be used to query and save instances of our entities. Now the only entity that we've created so far is the value entity. And it also mentions that the DB context is a combination of the unit of work and repository patterns. And we'll talk specifically about the repository pattern a bit later on. Now what we also want to do with this class is we need to create a constructor. So what we can do is put our mouse inside DataContext, the name of the class, and we can use our quick fix option again. And what we want to do in this case is generate a constructor for our DataContext. Now it's automatically put this as protected. We actually need this to be public, so I'm just going to change this to public. And inside our DataContext constructor, we need to provide it with some options. And what we do is we specify DB-Context options, and then we need to specify the type or the class that we're using for our data context. So we just reference data context in here, and then we specify options. And what we also need to do is call into the class we're deriving from and call its options as well. And the way that we do that is we specify a colon and then specify base and brackets and then specify options. Now we don't need to put anything inside this particular constructor, so I'm just going to move these squiggly brackets up. And then what we can do is tell our data context class about our entities. So what we do, we create a property inside here, and this is going to be a type of DB set, and then we specify value as the type of this particular DB set. Now we're getting the red underline again because we need to bring in the namespace where our value class is residing. Now this is residing in our models folder, so if we use the quick fix, we can specify to use datingapp.api.models, and the red underline goes away, and what we'll do is we'll call this values. And the name that we specify here is used to represent the table name that gets created when we scaffold our database. Now we've still got some more work to do because we need to let our application know about this DataContext class. We need to make this available as a service because we're going to want to consume this in other parts of our application. So let's head back to our startup.cs class, and what we're going to do is add this in our configure services method. So what we'll do is just at the top we'll specify services, and then we'll say add db context, and then we specify the class. In this case it's data context, and then what we need to do is give it some options. And what we also need to do here actually is bring in the using datingapp.api.data where our data context is residing. And then we need to specify some options for this, and specifically because we're connecting to a database, we need to provide it with the database provider that we're going to be using, and this is going to be using SQLite, and we also need to give it a connection string. So the way we do this, we provide it with a lambda expression, and what this means is we say x goes to x.use SQLite in this case, and then we can specify the connection string, and I'll just specify connection string as a bit of placeholder text for now. And we've got an issue here because use SQLite is not available as an option at this moment in time, and if we try and use the quick fix, then we can see that we don't have any options to bring in any using statements here, and the reason for that is we need to add SQLite as part of our entity framework core assembly. So let's go back to our NuGet packages, and we'll say NuGet package manager add package, and what we want here is Microsoft.entity-framework core and .SQLite, SQLite, and press return, and this brings up the option for Microsoft Entity Framework Core .SQLite. Please accept this one and not the .NET Core version or .core version, and we want to go for 3.0.0 just as we did before, and click on the restore button. And once this is installed, what we should be able to do is use our quick fix and specify using Microsoft Entity Framework Core here as well, and the error goes away. Also, when we installed those NuGet packages, if we go back and take a look at our CS proj file, then we can see inside here that these have been added as package references inside our CS proj file. So there's a couple of different options for adding packages. My preference is just to use the NuGet package manager, but you can come into the CS proj file directly and add the package references inside here using this particular syntax if you wish to do so. So now that we have our data context added as a service, what we need to do next is take a look at actually creating our database, and we'll take a look at that next.